Happy Monday, you guys. Well, how's everyone doing? We have gotten through our first 2 weeks of instruction. Now we're beginning our third, and this week is going to focus on poetry. Poetry is something that's very unique. I think that a lot of you have probably heard poems or you've seen different poetry, but you kind of shy away from it because you don't quite understand it. But poetry is something that is a beautiful expression. Many people, there are many artists that you know of that actually their rhyme schemes and the things that they have written is considered poetry. So I just want to fill you in on the little things about it. And we're not going to go very deep into a whole lesson of you guys having to write it or anything like that at this time. I'm just going to describe to you some of the different types and the structures. And then I'm going to read a poem to you. And this is a very unique poem, very interesting. And I'll tell you about the person that is most known for this poem, but is, in fact, the author is someone else. So the first thing that I want you to know about poetry is this chart right here that you see in front of you, right here, okay? We are going to talk about the acronym is SLAM. And SLAM means structure, language, effect, and meaning. These four words here. Now, the S in SLAM is for structure. And when they're speaking of structure in terms of a poem, it is divided into something called lines and stanzas. So if you have a poem, just as this poem right here, these are lines. You count each line of a poem, okay? And the lines are separated. Well, the lines are put together, four or more, and that is what equals a stanza. So in poetry, a stanza is a division of four or more lines. They're almost like paragraphs. They're what you call paragraphs in writing, okay? But that's what poetry consists of, and these are the forms that you will see it in. Lines, which you will be able to count, and then stanzas, which is the grouping of those lines. That is considered poetic structure. Okay, next you'll have language. Okay, and when we're speaking of language, what they're talking about is the figurative nature. So we have figurative language in poetry where they'll say things that have a completely different meaning than what you thought. Okay, so that's when things are figurative, when they're making these statements. But when they're speaking in terms of language and poetry, you're talking about rhyming schemes, you're talking about metaphors and similes. These are a lot of things that you guys have probably heard before. We will go deeper into those definitions if some of you aren't familiar with them, but we'll talk about that at a later time. That's the language. Next, you have the affect, okay? And some people say affect, but it's not effect. Remember, those are two different words. So the affect of poetry is the feeling, okay? The effect of poetry is how it's acted upon the person that is reading it. Okay, so that is the feeling that you get from the poetry and what it makes you feel, the images that it brings to mind. That is your effect. And then lastly, the meaning. Okay, we talk about what the author truly means when they're creating this work. All right, so that is a basic talk of the structure of poetry. Right, so next, let me close that one. Next, we have what is poetry? Well, right here on this anchor chart, I have poetry is all about compression. And you see this word right here in the middle? Press. Okay? So poetry is where An idea is compressed into a few lines. It's a compressed idea of something that is much bigger. And so the reader's job is to figure out what the big idea is that is squeezed into these stanzas, which I've just explained to you what stanzas are. So poetry is a compression of a big idea into stanzas. All right, so that's what you see here, the compression of a big idea into stanzas. And when you're reading poetry, you're going to read through it at least 4 times. Most poems are very short, so reading through it, just you gain a better understanding each and every time you go through it. And as you read these poems, we're going to ask ourselves questions. And each time you read through the poem, you're going to ask yourself a new question. Okay? So one poem that I want you guys to see is this one right here. It's called The Rose That Grew from the Concrete. Okay? Now, The Rose That Grew from the Concrete was made very popular by a rapper that you guys may know or may not know, but his name is Tupac Shakur. And he performed this piece and made it very famous. Many people think that he wrote it, but he did not. This poem is actually by an artist, a woman named Nikki Giovanni. Okay, you guys can look that up. So, this poem is called The Rose That Grew from the Concrete. Now, when we're reading through it, we're going to ask ourselves these questions over here. First, what does the poet feel? So let's see if we can think about some feelings that we get when we read this. I'll read it to you. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny, it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. Okay? So what is the feeling? What is the feeling? Do you feel, does this poem make you angry? No, I don't think so. I don't think this is something that inspires anger. I think the feeling that you feel from this is triumphant, maybe. Is that what we're saying? Because we know a rose, we're looking at a rose as being something that is delicate. Okay? So let's highlight that. This is a feeling. We're going to highlight it in pink. So a rose is something that is thought of as being delicate, right? And concrete is something that is thought of as being hard and coarse. So if you can take something delicate and it can rise from something that's hard and coarse, then that's a pretty amazing feat, right? So the feeling that I get when I read this is something triumphant, okay? So the next question that you ask, and you'll read through the poem again, is how are the poet's ideas conveyed? Okay? How are the poet's ideas conveyed? I see a comparison, right? There's a comparison here. So we're taking something delicate as a rose, but are they really speaking of the flower, the rose, or are they speaking of something more figuratively, like maybe a person? Okay. Could they be speaking about a person that has grown out of concrete, meaning a hard life? Okay. So you have to look at what are the poet's ideas? What are they trying to convey here? Are they trying to convey that no matter what circumstances someone comes from, that they can still flourish and grow? Could be. So these are the types of questions that you want to ask yourself. The third question, What is the poem really about? Okay, now that's what we just started talking about. They're saying, long live the rose that grew from concrete. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the phrase before. I'm sure you have. Long live the king. Well, that is showing a sign of reverence. That's saying that this person, when you say long live the king, it means that that person is so special that you hold them in some high esteem or high accord. So basically, in this poem, they're saying, long live the rose that grew from concrete. That person is triumphant. All right. So that's what this poem is really about, being triumphant in the hardest of circumstances. Okay. And then the fourth question, why did the poet write it? Because they wanted to convey this message. They wanted others to understand that no matter how hard circumstances are, things can be great. Right? Could be. So these are questions that you'll ask yourself when you're reading any form of poetry. And so for today, that's all we're going to cover. But I want you guys to think about it. I want you to think about something just as simple as this poem that Nikki Giovanni wrote and Tupac performed so magnificently. Okay? I want you to think about what the language is, what the poet is trying to convey, what the poet really means from these pieces that they write, and most importantly, how it makes you feel. All right? So we're going to dig into some poetry for the next couple days. I hope you guys really enjoy it. I think it's going to be a great lesson, and I think that you'll actually really see that this is a really fantastic genre. We'll be looking at some slam poetry, some spoken word, and I'm going to include some really great videos for you guys. So I hope you all enjoyed this short poem and just looking at poetry as a whole. And we're going to move forward and on to the next lesson. All right. So we have one more, and then don't forget that after you finish it, you're going to answer the questions and then press submit. All right. See you guys later.